Hi folks, it's Zach, and welcome back to my Star Wars Tips and Tricks section. And today we are talking about class balancing changes and a few other little things. So welcome back to another episode of Real Talk with Real Gamers, where we do, real talk. No bullshit. We just give it to you straight. Tonight with me, as always, is one of my faithful co-hosts, Penny. How you doing tonight, Penny?
I'm doing great, Zach. How are you?
I'm doing great. And we have a new guest star with us tonight. This is Sin, spelled C-Y-N, not S-I-N, guys. Sin, welcome to the show, man. I'm really glad to have you. How you doing tonight?
Pretty good. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Really cool. So as like a rite of initiation, we always ask all of our new hosts how they got into the wacky world of Star Wars. And this also kind of gives our listeners a chance to know like what our backgrounds are and why we're even doing the show. So I was wondering, dude, can you give us like the 2-minute version of how you ended up playing Star Wars: The Old Republic?
Yeah, for sure. 2-minute version because it's going to be way too long otherwise. Started out playing RTS kind of competitively. Was really big into StarCraft Brood War. Kind of got old after about 13 years of nothing new. Moved into Guild Wars 1 at a top tier competitive level for the PvP. And over moderation kind of drove all the community away from that one, plus it was an older game, and a bunch of the guys that we were playing with there actually said, hey, you should come check out Star Wars in beta, and kind of been here ever since.
Nice. All right, well, cool. So for all my listeners out there, if you guys have tuned into this show before, Real Talk with Real Gamers, we've mainly focused in on Star Wars: The Old Republic because that is the MMO all of us players play. We all have different backgrounds. All of us, though, currently are in the guild Morons and Mayhem on the Harbinger server, and if you are looking for a competitive raiding environment, the Harbinger is definitely the server for you, and Morons and Mayhem is always looking to recruit new good players who just like to, kill bosses and have a good time. So if you guys are interested, you can always hit up Penny on, the Harbinger with Morons and Mayhem and see if there's any spots available. But what we're talking about tonight, though, is class balancing changes. So if you guys have been paying attention to the Star Wars BioWare forums, or if you've gone to Dolphy.net, by the way, guys, Dolphy.net for all your Star Wars gaming needs. That's definitely one of those really good sites that if you haven't visited it yet, I highly recommend it. So Dolphy.net and the BioWare forums, if you go to either one, you can see what it is we're talking about here. But BioWare mentioned the theory craft behind how they rebalance classes. So if you've played Star Wars: The Old Republic before and you're already familiar with the classes, I won't go over all of them here, but typically you have what you do in most other MMOs. So you have melee classes, ranged classes, you have healers, you have tanks, and then more importantly, there's like several different definitions on how each one of those does the job they're doing. So if you're a melee, you might do a combination of either burst, sustained, or damage over time. And we're not going to go over all those terms tonight because we don't have to. If you look at the posts, they'll actually break down all of those things. So if you guys feel like, oh my god, it's like these guys are talking a completely different language, what are they saying? Just go to the post and you can read line by line every different term that we're going to use, DPS, heal over time, burst, sustain, what those things all mean, and then it won't sound quite like we're speaking a foreign language. But the main thing that we're talking about tonight, though, is the theory craft behind the way BioWare does these different changes. And to help me talk a little bit about healing and tanking, because I come from mostly a DPS perspective, I played the most a sniper or a gunslinger, which is a ranged DPS class. Penny is one of the best healers that I've ever met, and then Sin, even though we just met, I've heard wonderful things about him as a tank. So we're going to take a look at how these breakdowns came from BioWare and kind of look at them from those 3 different perspectives for the most part. So first things first, let's go ahead and talk about the concept of hitting the target line, which we call 0, and then they have what they call above the target line, so like plus 5%, or below the target line of negative 5%. And the theory crafting behind this, and first things, before we talk about the theory craft, we have to ask, does that breakdown seem like a fair idea? Does this really seem to work in terms of balancing character classes? Let's weigh in with Sin first. Sin, as far as a fair system of rebalancing character classes, do you think that idea of some classes should be automatically doing a little bit better by to a degree of like 5% or worse by a degree of 5%, devised by how difficult their job is perceived to be. Do you think that's a fair way to rebalance classes?
As a straight up analysis of just looking at the way that they've kind of lined everything up, I'm going to say no. But I would also say yes conditionally, given that a lot of the ones that they're looking at, primarily moving up to the 5% as opposed to down, are melee classes. So these are guys that intrinsically have to know a little bit more about the positioning, and so there is kind of that trade-off that if they can do that well, they should be able to theoretically hit those higher damage numbers. But if you don't do that well, you're really going to notice that the damage is not there. But at the same time, the when I start looking at the other end of it, where it's like, okay, why are we punishing people for being ranged? Just because they're ranged, their challenges are still there. They're just different. It's like with Tithe being the new operation out right now, a lot of ranged end up being pretty much in melee range most of the time anyway, because of mechanics. So to just go out and throw out like this blanket, this is what we're looking at for targets, it seems kind of short-sighted in the fact that there are so many mechanics that mitigate whether or not you can be an effective ranged or an effective melee right off the hop.
Right. I can definitely say as a sniper, I've always felt that jumping into and out of crouch, you have to do that before you can actually start using the majority of your really good moves. And you can do, now they've made it so you can do a lot of those moves outside of crouch, but you're just taking, the whole point of a sniper is that you crouch down, you get your shield, and you have now a ranged defensive buff that's, almost 30%. It's really outstanding. It's really good. And so the whole point of being a sniper is to basically hunker down and start firing. But what I've noticed is that, for me, I have felt it's kind of unfair, because many fights now, to add to complexity, they're making you move whether you're ranged or melee across the board, and so even though I can be on the far side of the field, I might have to be running away from ads that are eating my face. I might have to get out of, we jokingly call them the power puddle. And they're like, stand in that to boost your power, and it's like, no, that's the poison, that's the acid, that's what's gonna kill you. Your healers are gonna hate you for that. That's like the worst razz I've ever gotten in my entire life. Stand in the power puddle. But you're avoiding all these other elements, and I feel that as a ranged in a lot of these fights, the more complex fights, your DPS is going to get broken up just the same as if you had been in melee range and avoiding a stomp or like a frontal cone AoE. And so I don't always agree with the idea that because I'm ranged, I must be able to keep a beat on my target the entire fight. They specifically designed fights to prevent you from doing that. And so, I don't know. Penny, Sin, you guys both do a little bit more PvP. Do you think some of this balancing act, do you feel like this is more PvP related, or do you think this actually truly is more PvE, a more PvE concern?
I'm leaning honestly a little bit more towards PvE. Personally, I think I still feel like some of the things that they haven't changed are still going to be very powerful in PvP. And the one I'm mentioning is Merc changes that are upcoming. There's supposedly that nerf coming, but Mercs are just so, they wreck your face in PvP right now. Like, they hurt.
Yeah,
and they're pretty much they're little mini tanks. They have all these cooldowns and everything. I honestly feel like it's more PvE related, to be completely honest. Sin might disagree with me, but I don't see this affecting PvP really, at least for the Mercs, really hard at this point.
Yeah. What do you think, Sin? Do you feel like these changes... Actually, this is a good time to pull into those Merc changes. Penny actually plays a healing Merc, and Sin, do you play DPS Merc at all?
Very rarely and only casually.
Okay, yeah.
I am not nearly at the level of any of my tanks as I am with the DPS.
Okay. So it's safe to say no one in this channel really uses Merc DPS as their like main DPSer.
No.
Okay, so we are so this is for my audience, guys. We are kind of taking a little bit of a stab at it, but thankfully most of us know really good Mercs at some point in some way of the game. So we're gonna wing it a little bit because the Merc changes were the first ones that came out. If it was Sniper, oh man, it would be like an Irishman with a bottle of Jack in his gut. He'd be very opinionated about what they're nerfing this. Are you kidding me? 5%? Jeez, Louise! Just take that shirt off my back, why don't you? So let's talk a little bit about these changes. So with Mercs. Penny, you just said right now that Mercs are eating your face in PvP.
Yes.
Yeah. Sin, is that pretty accurate? Is that just what's happening across the board?
For the most part, with Penny thinking that these are PvE-related changes, I actually do disagree. I think these are primarily PvP changes because I play with probably some of the better Mercs on the server, and their thoughts on this are all that this is going to be a slight nerf that's relatively manageable, but at the same time, like, this is where this is really going to make a difference is where you see more Mercs more often, which is in PvP. And even as a tank, like, you get 2 or 3 Mercs on you, and it's a ridiculous amount of damage output. So realistically, I think this is probably where that's going to hit the most, because the PvE aspect of these nerfs strikes me as largely something that's just going to have to, changes in rotations or slight things that you have to do a little bit differently just to compensate for it. But it doesn't seem to be that big of an issue to me.
Yeah. I was on the fence. I haven't played a Merc in a while, but looking at the change to Barrage no longer increases the damage dealt by Blazing Bolts. I do know enough to remember, oh, damn, Blazing Bolts, that's the mainstay of Arsenal. That is where, a huge chunk of your damage is coming up, but still finishes his active cooldown, thinking that if there's a decrease, it no longer increases the damage dealt by Blazing Bolts, which in a weird way to me the inversion's true then. So the damage then is being decreased on Blazing Bolts, and if Blazing Bolts is the core mechanic, then that feels like a pretty decent sized nerf to the Mercs. We might not be feeling it yet, but we might feel it a little bit harder when the patch actually comes out. So I don't know. This is one of those like really tricky balancing acts, because I feel like, again, if they're tweaking it for PvE, and you guys can feel free to agree or disagree with this, and I'd love to hear what you think about it. But I feel that right now, just between the two of you guys, one of you thinks it's being changed for PvP, one of you actually thinks it's being changed for PvE. Either way, whatever change they were making, it will affect the other group. And I kind of feel like this is the problem sometimes with class balancing, is that something comes up in PvP, they try to balance it for PvP, and then something gets thrown way out of whack for PvE, and vice versa. Do you guys feel like that is accurate too with these class changes sometimes?
I mean, yeah, they've tried to change things, and it just drastically affects PvP. Because they tried to fix it for PvE. I mean, it would also probably affect PvP as well. I'm not disagreeing that it wouldn't. I just also feel like it's going to affect the raiding community too, because Mercs as of right now are still sort of a flavor of the month class.
Yeah. How do you see that changing after these? Well, actually, you guys have also been playing a little bit on the PTS. I know we can't talk about the PTS. I know.
First rule of PTS is don't talk about PTS.
Exactly. First rule of PTS is absolutely that. But I think, actually, you guys, we could talk about previous stuff, though. So let's talk about Vanguards a little bit. Vanguards, like, when I stopped raiding full-time, they were like it. They were the tank du jour. That is no longer the case. Obviously, the class got rebalanced. Sin, Penny, based off the past experience of like what happened to Vanguards. Actually, first, could you let our audience know what happened to Vanguards?
I'm gonna let Penny handle this one.
I mean, you're the tank, but I guess Vanguards and Powertech's tanks, they got nerfed really hard. Some of their key cooldowns or defensives took a really big hit. So like Oil Slick, I don't know what it's called on pub side. You can help me with that.
Smoke grenade, smoke bomb, something
right,
like that.
Gas.
Yes. Riot gas. Okay. It took a big hit, so it no longer absorbed. I think is it absorbed or negated the damage that when you're standing in it or when you drop it. So it really and overall their durability just seems to be not there. So a PowerTech tank or a Vanguard tank compared to others not only do they not have the defensive to kind of survive some of the hard-hitting attacks from like the apex bosses, they're kind of squishy. Like, in comparison to like a Sin tank, where before, I'm sure you remember, Zach, when Sin tanks were the squish, because they just weren't on par.
Yeah, that's when I stopped playing an Assassin and Shadow tank.
And, it did affect, with the changes they brought about, I mean, it affected our raid dynamic because we had a Power Tech tank full-time from 3.0 and 4.0, and he made the switch because we literally, he couldn't handle the class changes. He made the switch to Assassin.
Yeah. And then, Sin, did you have any similar thoughts on what happened at the Vanguards?
The bigger thing is I think the way that they had tried to change Vanguards, it was an interesting idea insofar as it was like, okay, we're gonna try and make these guys actually reliant on their armor. But because there are attack types in this game that exist that basically ignore armor, you didn't really give them anything reliable to be able to mitigate that. It's like Oil Slick right now is a mischance, and it's not a particularly good one. It's a 15% accuracy loss.
That's it?
It's only 15%. And the other part of it is a slow, and it's like, okay, well, a slow doesn't really benefit you in any situation in PvE. I mean, there's some situational cases, obviously, you could make for it, but it's not something that you would reliably want out of a defensive cooldown. And then Energy Shield is literally only a 25% damage reduction.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And I feel like that's not great. And with the state that they're in right now, it's like, yes, okay, they can get the job done, but the changes that have been done to them are such that the skill curve to be able to manage damage reductions from skills like Heat Blast, it requires such a high percentage of skill that there are very few players on this server, let alone this game, I think, that are capable of doing this kind of tank at a top tier level. It's just not something that you can do. You have to have very good healers that know the fight as well as you do in case there is a mistake made, in case you missed a damage reduction on a critical window. And there's not really much of a way that you can recover from that, whereas an Assassin or a Juggernaut, because they have A, more cooldowns, and B, better cooldowns, if a mistake is made, it's not the end of the world, and they can easily, if not at least somewhat moderately difficult, come back from that.
Right. And
whereas things like Nim Brontes being a prime example, this was kind of the thing that we touched on earlier. Assassins can tank her all day because of the state of their cooldowns. Juggernauts are not going to die from it. Power techs is anyone's guess. It literally depends on who's playing that power tech, because your defensive cooldowns cannot get you anywhere near that assassin level of durability.
Right. Which brings us to the worst version of racism that exists in any MMO, is that guy who's on Fleet saying, "Hey guys, you need tank for the raid. I'm a tank. Great, what kind are you? I'm a Vanguard! We don't want Vanguards! Are you kidding? You haven't even seen how I can play yet! But we don't care, you're a Vanguard, they suck!" And then all of a sudden you're completely discounted from even being on that pickup group, just because the reputation now of that class has gone down so far. I feel like that's one of the great travesties of what happens in an MMO when they retweak a class so hard. Because Vanguards, for a while, the great thing about them was not only that they were tough, but they were also mobile. They pop hydraulic overrides, and I hated them for this, dance in and out of different types of slows and AoEs that literally were just pounding the raid. And you just see them, zipping around at, better than full speed. And that was also giving them, I think it was Underlurker and, Revan were the two fights I think that really stood out for me, where all of a sudden you just see those Vanguards zipping around, and you just be like, "You bastard!" I
hate you so hard.
Yeah,
right now. Yeah.
I love you, but I hate you. And I remember there was a few fights where Vanguard tanks would just switch around to be, in DPS gear, and we would bring in, an extra DPS for something like Underlurker, and they'd wreck me. Here I am, a pure DPS class, And this guy came in, and his like refractive shield, popped at the
Or
right
like
time.
when they stand in trample.
Yeah! I
Yeah.
was like, are you freaking
Yeah.
kidding me, dude? Like, I spend my life and half my life on a dummy just to get my parses up, and you, because of one mechanic, can come in there and smoke every DPS that's in there, and that was, like, during the heyday of Vanguards. And so this is where I feel like the pendulum has swung the opposite way, and I think this is why it was so good to probably bring up Vanguards, because now they're like the poor cousin. They're
Yeah.
they're like handing out, like going raid to raid with their hands out, like, please, will you take me? I swear I could be good at this. And then now, Sin and Penny, like, what would you say the tank du jour is of Star Wars right now?
Without a doubt, it's the assassin.
It
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I have my favorite tank combos, and I really lean against two of the same class. So I really honestly lean against two assassin tanks, because there are certain fights where assassins do get just completely wrecked. And then, so I honestly, if I have two tanks, I prefer a assassin and a juggernaut, but there are fights where I do, you relent. You're like, okay, two assassins on this is amazing. And I know that, but I don't really like having two assassins, but that's just my personal thing as a raid lead and everything. But as far as creme de la creme, that's assassins right now.
Yeah, that really kicks my butt. That was actually the reason I stopped playing my Jedi Shadow, was because Shadows were like no good for a while.
Yep.
They gave Saber Reflect to Guardians and Juggernauts. Like, I remember when that first came out, and all of a sudden it was like, Saber Reflect, hey, what can this do? Holy crap, it completely reflected this entire boss's attack and one-shotted him! It one-shotted! Like, I mean, seriously. I was like, can we talk about a broken move? But then all of a sudden, Guardians were always pretty good, then they got great, and Shadows kind of like fell by the wayside for a long time there, because, I mean, Shadows for a long time really only had 2 innate defensive cooldowns. That was it. And then until like all the balancing act happened between Harness Shadows and basically keeping all your different stacks up, and then now I think Shadows do have a reflect. I haven't played a tank in so long, I don't even remember. Sin, Assassins, what do their cooldowns look like now?
Now they do actually have a reflect. The
Yes!
Reflection grants a reflect. It's different from the Juggernaut and Guardian one insofar as it doesn't mitigate all of the damage. I believe it's 50%, but they do still have a reflect, and it is still really strong because the duration on it is just ridiculous.
Yeah.
So there are situational things where it's like, okay, yeah, you can absolutely reflect that, and then there's other ones where it's like, you probably don't want to reflect that if you're trying to do it like a Juggernaut.
Right. And the cool thing about Shadows that they always had was that some of their cooldowns let them negate mechanics entirely. Not that is a very powerful move. As more raids will come out, that became more applicable to, because like in early raids, a lot of the damage would say be like ranged, and so you'd have a Guardian or a Vanguard with a move that like blocked blaster bolts well, and that was like, or it took a lot of damage off of ranged attacks, and it was like, okay, that was a good tank to have at the time. But then later on, all of a sudden you're getting these like dot-based mechanics or things that need to be cleansed, or all of a sudden now you have the Jedi Shadow kind of leap to the front as, oh, I could completely ignore that mechanic if I just Force Shroud or a Stealth Out or do these other things. I could completely just bypass that. And the more complicated the raid, I felt like the more negating a mechanic was more important than just being able to be tough against a certain type of damage. I don't know. I've been out of it for a while. Is that still pretty accurate, or especially now with the new bosses out? Do you feel like that might not be the most accurate assessment?
Well, I mean, I can bring up a couple of prime examples where that is very much still a thing. First off is, like I said, Nim Brontes, even hard mode Brontes. Assassins basically negate the need for a tank swap on just the sheer damage output of Arcing Assault, because their cooldowns let them do that. Another example is Writhing Horror. You have 2 assassin tanks there, you're never getting ads.
Yeah.
And like, these are things that assassins and shadows can do that nobody else can do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just the way that their class works. I had another example. Hard mode in Nim Dread Council. You have an assassin on Bestia. again, you can negate the need for a tank if you do it, or sorry, for a tank swap if you do it right. And it's just the fact that they have this power on top of a very powerful kit as it is literally means there is no one else in terms of tank classes that can touch what assassins can do right now. Sure, juggernauts are still, kind of middle of the road. They do jack of all trades, master of none type thing, but then you got these poor power techs that are forgotten and can't really do anything except two fights really well.
And I just keep thinking of them in like rusty armor sitting on the side of the road with their hands out with like a little little tank for food kind of sign,
Alms for the poor, yeah, absolutely. And it's a shame because like power techs were, for me, one of the more fun tanks to play. The fact that they had something that neither of the other two had, being a ranged AoE taunt, was kind of like, yes please. Like, I can be across the room and pull ads off a healer as opposed to having to run up to the healer and AoE taunt. It's like, okay, that's kind of cool. On top of that, their kit was, it's not like the Juggernaut or the Assassin, but it's so not good right now that it takes so many extra resources to try and make it work. And it's not to say that it isn't viable, you just have to be really, really good at it.
Right. Yep. All right, and so let's swing back a little bit and talk a little bit more about class balancing. And we got a little off topic because we started talking about tanks. Most of what BioWare's post was about was with DPS, because most of what you find comprised in a raid usually have a tank, a healer, and 2 DPS for a 4-man squad, and then everything just doubles for a larger group. So half your raid is the DPS. So how these guys get balanced out does definitely affect the composition of your raid and how smoothly things are going to go. But here's one of the things that I wanted to bring up with you guys, because I know you guys have seen this happen enough times. Because, oh my god, all healers across the board got a huge healing nerf not that long ago. When was that, Penny? That was...
the Sort got hit with it. It wasn't really a nerf. It was more they just increased the force cost, and I think that came along with 5... Was it 5.2? It was 5.0. I think it was 5.0. And then Mercs were in 3.0. They lost like that extra crit buff with their supercharged gas, because there was like a 3% crit increase when you were using your supercharged gas. At the time, it was amazing.
Yeah.
And then I don't actually play operatives, so I know operatives at one point were really, really viable, especially like in 2.0, I think it was. And they kind of fell to the wayside as well in favor of like Merc. And then with Sorks, there was one point where you could just like cast everything and there was no force cost. It was in 3.0. It felt like. But yeah, so, we've been touched by the nerf bat, and it's actually happening again in the future, I think. So we'll see what happens, at least with Sorks.
Yeah, because I'm trying to remember. I remember we had this conversation. I think it was with Zenoff on one of our other episodes where we were talking about the new check for the raid, where it used to be like almost always it was always like a DPS check, to kind of get through there, and all of a sudden that had somewhat shifted towards more of the heal check because I felt like all the healers had been across the board affected. And so here's it kind of brings us into our next point. So with BioWare and their DPS statement of here's how we look at DPS and figure out how to kind of rebalance the classes, there's like 2 glaringly obvious things that don't really get addressed. And the first is player ability. It basically, to make these changes, they assume that every player who plays this character class plays it virtually the same, and therefore that class has an overall advantage over all the rest, which I don't actually believe is true, because we've all seen, Zach, mediocre players for a particular class. You see that guy in the raid who's like he's wearing the same gear you are, it's the same fight you're in, and yet somehow they're pulling some redonkulous numbers, and the other guy who's playing the exact same class, exact same spec, with almost the exact same gear is doing like not even close to the same amount of damage. That says a lot about player ability, and yet both of which have been nerfed the same way. And and so I kind of feel like a lot of times these nerfs, when they look at the class, they'll go to something like Star Parse, public parse and stuff, and say like, oh my god, the top 10 DPSers right now are all and I used this example before the show, engineering snipers. Therefore, engineering sniping must be ridiculously overpowered. Therefore, we need to reduce that. When in actuality, it was maybe 30 guys in the world who can actually parse and DPS at that level on a dummy, and that changes completely inside of an actual fight. And then again, those guys were like parsing heroes. They're really good at it, and the average player may not even be able to pull anything close to that, even with an advantage or disadvantage. And so I kind of feel like that's like one kind of glaring flaw. And then the other one is something I didn't mention before, which is the utilities of each class is different. One of the reasons I've been lucky with a gunslinger is we have ballistic shield, which is just an awesome utility. And they only made it better with some of the utility talent points you can put into it. And and if you're running, say, like a scoundrel, DPS, who has to be in melee range, is basically doing dots, not getting the same kind of utility that a sniper would. And so I feel like that kind of affects things too in what raid choices we choose to bring. So here's my question to you guys. If we're looking to rebalance classes, what are you think some fair options on ways that they can retune and rebalance characters? If they're not going to use, say, a model that says, here's the target that we're looking for, and here are the classes we feel inherently should be above or below that line.
Penny, you want to go first?
You can go first. That's fine.
Okay.
Go ahead.
The primary issue that I have with just picking these targets, as they've called them, is there's not really any disclosure on where they have gathered this target information from.
Yes, good point.
So I think even if they just made a line like, hey, this is where we got, this is where we've extrapolated this data from, this is what we're going off of, that would give us a little bit more insight as to where these changes are coming from. Because as it is right now, with no information, it's like, okay, it feels like, as you said, this is coming from that top percentage of players in each spec, because let's face it, players that aren't there probably aren't parsing, so there's not the data up there for them to extrapolate from in the first place. It also kind of shows that it's like, okay, you might be a little bit out of touch if you're not aware of the general idea of how these changes can affect individual raid instances. It's like, okay, there's situations where I could say, okay, well, having 5% more target or 5% more than target DPS on a melee class should be, a reward. Because they have X number of mechanics to do, it's this much harder for melee to do their DPS. Prime example would be running more than 2 melee on like Nim Dreadguards. There is a huge reward there if you can pull that off well. But at the same time, because you're catering your DPS or your team composition to the raids, I feel like if you're just throwing out these random targets without the insight as to why, it kind of hurts the player faith in the quality of those balances, because it's almost like you're out of touch with what's going on in those instances, rather.
Yeah, and I have to agree with you on that one, because when you say like, oh yeah, we're melee should have, say, 5% over the target board of DPS, awesome, but then the raid that just came out favors entirely raged, where every boss mechanic has something that is just absolutely like grinding up all your melee all the time anyway. And so you're like, okay, well, I see why you gave them the 5% above the board. It just didn't do any good, because now raids are only pulling in ranged for that fight, because ranged are the only guys who live. They're the only, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's I remember for a while there was a time where, Marauders were just looked at as like the most gigantic liability in a raid.
That was 3-0.
Yeah, where they had virtually no defensive cooldowns, no real raid utility except for a damage buff, and for the most part, it was like every single boss seemed designed to just flatten every melee character out there, and it was just brutal. And I remember, like, during the Underlurker fight, when that first came out, so this must have been the Revan expansion. Help me out.
3-0.
3-0, thank you. They finally gave them the ability to, oh God, why can I not remember the names of anything? Basically, they could just enhance the speed of the entire raid.
Predation.
Predation.
Predation, thank you. Couldn't remember for the life of me. But all of a sudden there was like, ooh, actually, maybe now this would help our raid if we had this guy in this one particular fight. And then they started the whole 5% damage dealing buff to them, and it felt like they were a little bit more viable. And so it did kind of help out the Marauders for a while. But then if they're not taking into account the next type of fight that they're making, almost none of the advantage or disadvantage really comes into account anyway. That's at least been my kind of feeling on it. And with what's come out so far with the latest raid, how do you guys feel? Do the new fights that are coming out still feel like a +5 or a -5% above or below the line spread still feels accurate? Because from what I've been hearing about the new mechanics, it feels like everybody's really having a rough time, or everybody's designed to have a rough time.
I mean, I would.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would kind of agree, because again, let's take Untithe for example. You have ranged, you have melee. Everyone's pretty much in melee range anyways, except for the melee who have to like run to the Graces or run to wherever the ads are. And like our team, we run heavy melee. We have one ranged.
Yeah.
So is it a little bit more punishing for the teams who have like an unfavorable comp, so to speak? Yeah, I would think so, especially if they nerf or increase a certain thing. It's gonna affect team dynamics, I think. And
actually, that brings up a really good question. Do you feel this system actually creates that problem of having a favorable or unfavorable composition? Do you feel
yes.
like yeah? How so?
Well, let's take Revan, for example. Everyone wanted bounty hunters because of aberration pushes and pulls, or pushes and pulls, and then the aberrations. You pop your hydraulics, you can cheese. That was like when bounty hunters or master and blaster, you could pop your hydraulics and blow up the bombs, or have snipers hunker down and run into each other, and you don't have to do that mechanic. You don't have to stay away from each other. You don't have to worry about the push-pull. You can just stay in DPS. I really feel like it affects how the team comp works. There was a time where, Juggernauts were not a DPS that most people would want on their team because they don't really bring like a raid buff. They're mostly a dot spread because of the main spec that most people play. And unless the Juggernaut's really good and can bring all their raid utilities, like their cooldowns and everything that they have, that's not something that most teams would want, for certain expansions and stuff.
Yeah. Have we seen any time, and I'm looking specifically at Annihilation Marauders, Watchmen Sentinels, Hatred Assassins, Serenity Shadows, all the guys that lift at the top or the +5%. With making changes so that those guys do have +5%, have we seen those guys become then the more desirable composition for a raid, or has that benefit not actually helped them get into more raids?
I mean, I don't think it's really helped the assassin as much. I don't see very many DPS assassins, particularly ones that are skilled with their class. That just might be that nobody really has the interest in running them for X reason. A good Marauder, on the other hand, because they are still pushing the top ends of what damage is capable, has made itself more of an asset since changes like Predation came in. It ultimately does require a little bit more tuning for a quote-unquote ideal composition, but they have definitely carved out a place for themselves for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This is where I kind of feel like utilities play such a big thing, because personally my marksman sniper is at the -5% of target DPS. It's always kind of the low end of the totem pole, but as I said earlier, the fact that the character itself can cheese mechanics or pop out a ballistic shield and or pop smoke, which was like almost giving a tank a secondary cooldown, and when facing like a huge mob of enemies. And now it's even better, man. You pop that smoke out, and you are getting an armor penetration buff on the group that it's out on. I mean, that's just insane. No reason not to throw that out every time your tank is surrounded. In fact, I would almost say use that on cooldown. But then, but I did feel the brunt of it when we're in a movement intensive fight, where everybody's moving around, and all of a sudden it's like, man, my -5% DPS looks like more like a -10 by the time this fight is done, and I'm just getting basically pissed on by the other guys in the raid, just being like, Zach, come on, man, where's your DPS? Jeez, you're leaving it home today? You know, you're like, parsing heroes and up until the handle breaks off, and you just kind of like go to that zone. You know, but I was lucky. I was a sniper. The Arsenal Mercs and like the Lightning Sorks, which is really interesting because we were talking about this earlier, that Arsenal Mercs are wrecking people's face, and yet they're listed as like the negative 5% target of DPS. That is a class that they have tried to put below the bar. Here's what I'm wondering is, do you guys feel like they've already been at negative 5% and they're dropping like even further, or do you feel like that's not even a close and accurate assessment to the kind of damage that character class actually does?
I'd have to say that it depends on the instance, because for PvP, I like there's few classes that I would put above snipers and mercs right now.
Yeah.
Just because they are like their damage profiles are just literally that good. I mean, you go into war zones right now and you can see Arsenal mercs hitting you for like 36. We'll go with around 36k damage on a heat seeker missile, and it's like that is a quarter of my health.
Yeah.
Yep. And if you got
like,
3 of them,
damn.
Mm-hmm.
And while they're not all necessarily going to be hitting that, because gearing comes into effect, as well as utilities, as well as, you know, did the player proc his effects first, or is he just dry heat seekering you? I mean, those are considerations that have to make. But for PvE, on the other hand, Arsenal Mercs have kind of been what I would consider the target. It's like you'll get the flavor of the month ones right now, like lethality operatives. That'll go way and above just about every merc in just about every fight. But mercs are still kind of where you say, okay, this is kind of our cutoff line. Like, we don't want anything below this. And I feel like nerfing them puts them in a spot where it's like, okay, well, you already had to work in PvE for this. This is where my thought that this is more of a PvP adjustment comes from.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I remember we were talking last night, and I thought you brought up a really good point. Because let's switch gears a little bit here. So we've been talking a lot about how we feel about the Star Wars / BioWare methodology between class balancing, which ultimately comes down to the idea that if we believe your character has a natural advantage to continually do DPS, we're going to put you a little bit lower balanced than the class that we think has a tougher time doing it. I.e., if you're a melee type person and you are constantly moving to keep up with a boss, we are going to give you a bit of a natural advantage. If you are the kind of person that hangs kind of in the rear, you know, and can burst really high and, you know, not really have any trouble switching targets, etc., we're going to put you a little lower. That's the theory craft behind that. But one of the things we talked about last night is that not all games use that same kind of theory craft. In fact, we were talking about Guild Wars 2, and maybe you could share with our audience members who don't play Guild Wars 2 how Guild Wars 2 does it when it comes to balancing some of these moves between PvE and PvP when they feel that something needs to change.
Yeah, well, I mean, the bigger thing with, and this wasn't just Guild Wars 2, this was also Guild Wars 1. The developers of that game figured out very, 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 very quickly that the way that some of the skills were geared for PvE were probably detrimental to the health of the game for PvP. They were on par for what they needed to be for the PvE instances, but then you roll these skills into PvP with certain other complementary skills, and they become just this god tier, untouchable level of bring it or lose to it. So what they had ended up doing was they had actually started rolling out instances of the skills. It's like the second that you would, for Star Wars to be able to do this, the equivalent would be the second that you queue for PvP is it re-rolls the stats on certain skills to change them to a PvP or PvE only variant. Now, Guild Wars was kind of in a unique situation where they had both skills that changed and skills that were only available for PvE. I don't think Star Wars is quite that far in that they need to get there, but they do need to consider possibly, and I think it would be actually really beneficial if they did, would be looking at those adjusted values for PvP skills.
I think so too. Penny, what do you think about it when it comes to alternative methods of tweaking characters? Has anything come across your mind where you're like, oh, you know what? Instead of it doing this way, maybe they could try this.
No, I've always been on the same boat as Sin, where if you are in a PvP instance or in a PvP area, it should re-roll your stats to make it a PvP zone. Like you once you enter PvP, that should be what you're given. Because then it allows them to, okay, this is overpowered in PvP, we change it in PvP, it does not affect PvE. And it provides this line for their balancing. Like, I'm in complete agreement with it. If it's an issue in PvP, you fix it, and it's just in that PvP instance, and same for PvE. And that right there kind of would help prevent, I feel, like flavor of the month classes. Mm-hmm. And it would give people more freedom to play whatever they want.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. And looking at a lot of the different classes, the reason I somewhat disagree, not with the principle, I think the principle's really sound when it comes to, when you just look at the straight idea of the theory craft of, you know, we put some of these guys higher, some of these guys lower based on how difficult we think it is for them to sustain doing damage, against the boss. In principle, I definitely agree. You know, obviously the person who's really close to a boss and has to move all the time would have to, giving them a little bit of an edge. That does seem to make sense. However, what I've seen with bosses is that is not all the case, because no boss is uniform like that. You know, they don't make every single boss the exact same way, which is melee have to move and range can stand in the back, just peppering shots. That would just be so boring if every boss was created the same. And so what I end up feeling like is that most of the time, one boss will be tuned for melee, one boss is tuned a little bit for, ranged, and you're kind of working your way around. You kind of have to throw your numbers out the window a little bit and just say, like, okay, how do I just be the best damn raider I can be for this particular fight? And with that idea of balancing, I kind of feel like if it's not really broken, don't fix it. I basically say keep most moves the same unless there's a glaringly obvious problem with it, such as Reflect being able to damage deal something back to a boss that one-shots the boss. That's broken. that kind of needs to go. But the idea of, like, everybody gets a Reflect, or everybody gets a movement escape, or everybody gets one of these, it's like, well, it's the differences that make the spice of each different character class. This is where I think things get kind of tough. Orbital Strike was like a really good example of one particular move that was getting super abused in PvP, because you just have operatives standing there like peppering Orbital Strike on top of themselves while healing like mad dogs, and you couldn't get close enough to like really get after them. And so they nerfed Orbital Strike all the way across the board based off of something bad that was happening in PvP. And so, for me, that is kind of the thing I'd like to avoid, because Orbital Strike was actually kind of a cool move. However, what they replaced it with was way better. Sweeping gunfire. I have a lot of love for that. But yeah, I just kind of felt like all players across the board, were dealt this hand because there was a problem with it in one particular area. And maybe a different way to look at it would be to say, okay, if it's just this one move that's having trouble, maybe we just reduce it a little, see if that fixes the problem, or do what you guys were talking about. We separate out PvP, PvE instances, and that way the PvEers get to keep it at full blast. The PvPers, now it's like it's like a love tap. It changes the way you fight, and it makes you just learn a different style. One of the things that I like, I've been playing Final Fantasy XIV, and one of the things that I've always really kind of appreciated about that game is that there's so many different jobs that even if they've tweaked something a little bit, you at any time could just say, like, hey, I just want to play this other thing for a while and kind of get a groove on it. And I felt balanced things out pretty well there, because they don't make radical changes. They just sort of say, if this class does a little bit more damage, cool. If this class doesn't do as much damage, maybe we'll give them a better utility that the other classes don't. So like Bards do range damage. They don't do as much damage, like straight damage, as a lot of the melee classes, but then they have stuff that buffs the entire raid, and that makes everybody want to have a bard anyway. And that's kind of like the good trade-off, I feel, is when you need something in these different fights, it's good to have these guys that bring that little something extra. Anyway, so we've kind of covered that a little bit, I think, too, which is the difference between what made a superior class based off of a mechanic they could cheese. I think we all, help me if I'm out here, kind of in agreement that tweaking character classes above or below the line as far as their DPS has not seemed to make them more or less desirable in the raid environment. Would that be accurate? I think we all agree on that?
To an extent.
To an extent.
There's the banhammer that they dropped on DPS orcs, but that's more more of the exception than the rule.
Yeah.
Could you tell our viewers a little bit about that, guys?
They used to be a really, 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 really amazing DPS, and now one of their specs comes in. I'm going to assume it's what they mean above target, and it's not very much. It's like 300 DPS over target.
Are you talking
Lightning Sork?
Lightning Sork? Yeah, Lightning Sork is marked at the -5. I actually think they probably got hurt worse than that, based on what you guys said.
The upcoming changes are also going to buff the Madness or Hatred. Madness Sork and Hatred Assassin, because apparently they are below the mark.
Yeah.
Sorks just are not in a good place right now.
Yeah. I think, man, I don't know if I'm right about this, but Sorks, because they depend on, depending on your different spec, some of the same moves. So, I mean, if you were... Anyway, I'm not really a Sork expert. I'm actually going to stop trying to talk about it like I am. But we noticed that tweaking the Sorks, it ended up being across the board, not just for one particular spec that might have been doing more damage than the other. Right?
Sorks haven't been really something that you would want in a raid for... what is it, like at least 2 patches? Mm-hmm. I think, right, Sin?
I remember they used to be really, really good in 2.0.
Yeah.
Yeah. I did not have a Sork on my team in 3.0. 4.0 we did, and now we still do in 5.0, and he works his little heart out to bring all the numbers. But again, he's the exception to the rule. Like when I go on my Lightning Sork, I don't pull nearly as high. Now, granted, I don't DPS as often, but it's still a very humbling experience when you're like, okay, I know my class is a little gimp, and I'm at the bottom of the board by like 600 DPS or more, depending on how much I'm having to fucking move. Oh, excuse me. But depending on how much I'm supposed to move, you have to take into account this is sort of just in general for any of these nerfs as well as buffs, you have to take into consideration the player, their skill level, and then also like the raid as well. I mean, the raids aren't going to cater to everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you think, Sin?
I mean, the harder issue that it comes into is it's like, again, I feel like they, to an extent, don't look at it so much as this is an issue of what we need to take away from them because it's maybe too strong. And what can we give them back to put it more in line with what we're looking for? It seems like it's more been, we're going to take away and see where it lies from there. And it's like, that's not the greatest idea because you create the flavor of the month doing that. Yeah. Whereas it's more like the prime example that I'm going to keep coming back to is the Assassin Reflect when it was one-shotting bosses. They didn't nerf assassins into the ground. They just scaled back how much damage could be reflected off of deflection, and I feel like a lot of the time that's what they should maybe do is maybe err on the side of caution with it with the buffs, especially since you don't want to create these flavor of the months because then you get people that are hardcore mains on one class and that's what they like to play in everything, and now you've made it so that they're that poor kid on the fleet trying to get into a pug group and nobody wants it because they have no idea how good this person is if they're going to be able to make up for the nerfs on it. Mm-hmm. So I like with the prime example being the Merc buff here. I maybe would have done away with a couple of these nerfs, and like if the bigger one was what they were worried about, like I'd honestly have to say, if it was me, I probably would have looked at just the critical damage bonus provided by target tracking or deadly cannon, and maybe increasing the heat cost on blazing bolts, and see if that brings them more in line. It strikes me that having both that critical damage reduction as well as the barrage no longer increasing your damage, might be venturing into the realm of overkill. Because, I mean, it's not like they can't turn around and adjust these later, but the problem that we run into is when they hit something so hard like they did the DPS sorcerers and sages, it takes them very, 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 very long time to realize that, hey, these aren't, like, we've made these a not desirable, not viable, whatever you want to call it, spec, and now we have to fix this.
Yeah. And that takes a long time to swing back. Okay, well, we never promised to solve all of Star Wars problems in a single night. We are not the ghosts of Christmas future, past and present. But we did have a good time talking about the issues tonight, and I got to let these guys go to go on and raid. But before we do, we're going to do something a little different tonight, where we've never tried this before, where I've got 5 questions for our guest star to finish off the night. So I love the way they do this on talk shows, and we're going to try it here. So, surprise! Yeah, they didn't know it was coming, but here it goes. Okay, so I promise for my viewers out there, I'll figure out some good music to play for this when I do the editing. But for now, okay, so here's, without further ado, here are my 5 questions to my guest star, and we'll start with Penny! Penny! Okay, so don't think, just answer. Favorite Star Wars The Old Republic moment?
When, in the Inquisitor storyline, you kill Lord... Is it Zash? Yeah.
Yes!
Yes. Killing her and putting her in Kimball.
Yes! Nice. I like it. Warning, the RB might spoilers ahead.
Yes.
Okay, Penny, favorite Star Wars The Old Republic class?
Sorcerer, healer.
Really? Sorc healer?
I love my Sorc healer. I mean, my Merc is my favorite too, but, you know, Penny has a soft spot in my heart, obviously.
No, I dig that. Okay, I like the way, you're not hardline party faction. Okay. Penny, if you could change or tweak one aspect of the game to make it better, what would it be?
I want to be able to put my hood up or hood down.
Oh! Yes! I love it! It's such a simple thing. And if the hood's up, see some hair. Yeah, a little bit. Okay. Favorite Star Wars quote?
Submit or let yourself be unmade.
Of course.
Oh, mic drop. Boom. Love it. Okay. And last but not least, if you could be a Star Wars character, who would it be?
Brontos.
Oh!
Amazing! I love Brontos.
What? Oh, I was not expecting that. Really? Brontos.
Yeah,
Okay.
Brontos.
Okay. Chick with that many arms. I guess that's kind of hot. Okay.
Wings of the Archetype, yeah.
All right. So heading over to Sin. Sin. All right. Favorite Star Wars moment?
It would have to be Zyos when from the. You have to be playing a warrior from this. When the Emperor promises that he's going to kill you last.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good one. Okay, favorite Star Wars The Old Republic class?
Guardian/Juggernaut, without a doubt.
No kidding, and yet you're kind of like the assassin tank dude. That's kind of cool. What is it? This isn't part of the 5 questions. Oh, but what is it that draws you to that particular class?
Probably just the tanking aspect of it. The fact that you've got so much for player shutdown. Really big PvPer as well. Yeah, might have given Penny PTSD from how well I interrupt her. So
as a healer, having him against me is it's scary.
It's definitely something I like. Just primarily being able to brute force everything. I've never really been so much into the sorcery of the Force, and more the enhancing of your own physical stats are definitely more my kind of thing. So skills like backhand.
Yeah. That's cool. Okay, if you could change one thing about the game or tweak one aspect of the game to make it better, what would it be?
Oh, crap. What have I complained the most about? Fingerless gloves. Why are there so many of them?
Why are there so many? Oh, dude, I only there are like 2 pairs in the entire game.
Oh no, there's way more than that. There's
Oh,
gloves.
jeez,
Because they're
man.
hobo gloves.
I love those things. Okay, you and I can't be friends anymore. I love those on my sniper or on any character that wields a weapon.
We
I
need
love
more
it.
artistic lightsaber designs.
Oh, interesting. Okay, more artistic lightsaber designs. I like it. Favorite Star Wars quote? Which movie was that in? I don't remember that one.
That's a good question. God, I can't even think of one now. Probably anything by the Emperor when he wakes up.
Oh, in the Old Republic.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Or rather, the one where he comes up and says, "There is no life, there is no death, there is only the Force, and I am the master of it." That's probably my favorite.
That's a pretty butch quote. Yeah, that's pretty good. That is pretty good. Okay, if you could be a Star Wars character, who would it be?
Are we limited to the game?
No. I said Star Wars. This is all Star Wars, guys.
Here we go. I've got to go with Starkiller.
Starkiller. Oh, from Force Unleashed.
Yep.
Oh yeah, dude, Galen Merrick. Right? That was the name of the character.
Being able to pull Star Destroyers out of orbit? Yes, please.
Yeah, I know. It's like, I'm not sure it's canon, but it was cool. Alright, and look at that, we're out of time, so I guess we can't do me. Anyway, thank you so much for coming to listen to Real Talk with Real Gamers. I'm just kidding, I have to do this too. Alright, favorite Star Wars moment? Kissing Kira Carson. And even better, when she pulls you back in and it's like, yep, still not quite feeling guilty. You're not over the guilt. She just like yanks you back in. I'm like, seriously, I will play a Jedi Guardian just to get up to that moment, just to see it again. You know, yeah, I'm cheesy like that. What can I say? Favorite Star Wars class from the Old Republic? It's actually, I have to say, the Jedi Knight. Most specifically, it's the Jedi Guardian. But the one I end up playing the most is actually the Marksman Sniper. Alright, if you could tweak one aspect of the game to make it better, what would it be? Universal banking. Please.
Yes.
Please. Universal banking. All my tunes having access to the same pot of currency. That'd be great. Favorite Star Wars quote? Do or do not. There is no try. That is always going to be my favorite quote. And then if I could be a Star Wars character, who would it be? That's pretty simple. It would, well, no, actually it's a tie. Wedge Antilles, because there's only one man in the universe running around with 2 Star Destroyers painted on his hull. That's him. Or Kyle Katarn, because he's the Chuck Norris of the Star Wars universe. Alright. And if you don't believe me, go look up Kyle Katarn facts on Google. And that's all the time we have tonight, folks. That's Real Talk with Real Gamers. I hope you enjoyed what we talked about here tonight. If you did, please like and subscribe to my channel. And that lets me know that you enjoy this kind of content, you want to see more of it. And we will see you next time.